3 days after his April 10th speech, Hitler is back on the same Munich stage. If the previous speech was a call for hatred and a preview of the coup to come, this one is something different in scope. It is his complete theory of world history, delivered in a single sitting. War, peace, international law, British imperialism, American intervention in World War I, Freemasonry, the Russian Revolution, all of it is explained, and all of it leads to the same conclusion. What makes this speech analytically important is not just its anti-Semitism, which is extreme even by the standards of his other speeches, but its structure. Hitler is constructing a total explanatory framework, a conspiracy so vast that it accounts for every major event of the past century. When a political movement offers its followers an explanation for everything, it has crossed from politics into something closer to religion. This speech is the moment that crossing becomes complete.
In our view, the times when there was no League of Nations were far more honorable and more humane. We ask, must there be wars? The pacifist answers, no! He proceeds to explain that disputes in the life of peoples are only the expression of the fact that a class has been oppressed by the ruling bourgeoisie. When there are in fact differences of opinion between peoples, then these should be brought before a peace court for its decision. But he does not answer the question whether the judges of this court of arbitration would have the power to bring the parties before the bar of the court. I believe that an accused ordinarily only appears voluntarily before a court, because if he did not, he would be fetched there. I should like to see the nation which would allow itself to be brought before this League of Nations court in the case of a disagreement without external force.
Hitler opens by attacking the League of Nations, established in 1920 as the world's first attempt at collective international security. With what sounds briefly like a reasonable objection, international courts have no enforcement mechanism. This observation was not unique to Hitler. It was a genuine weakness of the League, one that its architects openly acknowledged and struggled with. But notice how Hitler uses a real institutional limitation to reach a totalizing conclusion. Not that international law needs reform or strengthening, but that the very idea of peaceful dispute resolution is naive and absurd. His argument is that force is the only real language of international affairs, and that any institution claiming otherwise is either delusional or dishonest. This framing serves a precise political purpose. It preemptively delegitimizes every diplomatic or legal constraint on German military action. If law without force is a joke, then the only path to German restoration is military power, and anyone who suggests otherwise is a fool or a traitor.
In the life of nations, what in the last resort decides questions is a kind of judgment court of God. It may even happen that in case of a dispute between two peoples, both may be in the right. Thus, Austria, a people of 50 millions, had most certainly the right to an outlet to the sea. But since in the strip of territory in question the Italian element of the population was in the majority, Italy claimed for herself the right of self-determination. Who yields voluntarily? No one. So the strength which each people possesses decides the day. Always before God and the world, the stronger has the right to carry through what he wills. History proves he who has not the strength, him the right in itself profits not a whit. A world court without a world police would be a joke. And from what nations of the present League of Nations would then this force be recruited? Perhaps from the ranks of the old German army? The whole world of nature is a mighty struggle between strength and weakness, an eternal victory of the strong over the weak. There would be nothing but decay in the whole of nature if this were not so. States which should offend against the elementary law would fall into decay. You need not seek for long to find an example of such mortal decay. You can see it in the Reich of today.
The stronger has the right to carry through what he wills. This sentence, delivered in caps for emphasis, is not a political argument. It is a statement of a worldview, a complete moral philosophy in 12 words. Hitler is articulating social Darwinism, the application of evolutionary competition to human societies, in which the struggle between nations mirrors the struggle between species, and in which victory is its own moral justification. This ideology was not invented by Hitler. It had been circulating in European intellectual and political circles since the late 19th century, but he states it here with a directness that most of its proponents avoided. The invocation of nature as the model for human society is worth examining closely. Nature has no courts, no rights, no obligations, only force. By declaring nature the template, Hitler is not just rejecting the League of Nations, he is rejecting the entire project of civilization as a restraint on power, and he is doing it, notably, in the name of God. Before God and the world, the stronger has the right. Divine authority and natural law are collapsed into a single justification for conquest.
Before the war, two states, Germany and France, had to live side by side, but only under arms. It is true that the War of 1871 meant for Germany the close of an enmity which had endured for centuries, but in France a passionate hatred against Germany was fostered by every means by propaganda in the press, in school textbooks, in theaters, in the cinemas. All the Jewish papers throughout France agitated against Berlin. Here again to seek and to exploit grounds for a conflict is the clearly recognizable effort of world Jewry. The conflict of interests between Germany and England lay in the economic sphere. Up till 1850, England's position as a world power was undisputed. British engineers, British trade conquer the world. Germany, owing to greater industry and increased capacity, begins to be a dangerous rival. In a short time, those firms which in Germany were in English hands pass into the possession of German industrialists. German industry expands vastly, and the products of that industry, even in the London market, drive out British goods. The protective measure, the stamp made in Germany, has the opposite effect from that desired. This protective stamp becomes a highly effective advertisement. The German economic success was not created in Essen alone, but by a man who knew that behind economics must stand power, for power alone makes an economic position secure. This power was born upon the battlefields of 1870-71, not in the atmosphere of parliamentary chatter. 40,000 dead have rendered possible the life of 40 millions. When England, in the face of such a Germany as this, threatened to be brought to her knees, then she bethought herself of the last weapon in the armory of international rivalry, violence. A press propaganda on an imposing scale was started as a preparatory measure. But who is the chief of the whole British press concerned with world trade? One name crystallizes itself out of the rest: Northcliffe, a Jew.
This passage is Hitler's theory of the origins of World War I, and it is constructed by layering real history with a single false addition at every step. The economic rivalry between Germany and Britain in the late 19th century was real and well documented. The Made in Germany label, introduced in 1887 as a British warning to consumers, really did become a mark of quality. The geopolitical tension between the two powers was a genuine driver of pre-war instability. But at each point where Hitler's historical account reaches a moment of conflict or decision, he inserts the same explanation: the Jews engineered it. French hatred of Germany, Jewish newspapers; British turn to aggression, Jewish press. The name he produces, Northcliffe, was Alfred Harmsworth, 1st Viscount Northcliffe, the founder of the Daily Mail and one of the most powerful press barons in British history. He was not Jewish. This is a factual error, not a distortion, a straightforward lie delivered, with the confidence of a man who does not expect his audience to check. The technique is consistent throughout the speech. Real history, false attribution, presented as revelation.
A campaign of provocation is carried on with assertions, libels, and promises such as only a Jew can devise, such as only Jewish newspapers would have the effrontery to put before an Aryan people. And then at last, 1914, they egg people on. Poor violated Belgium, up to the rescue of the small nations, for the honor of humanity. The same lies, the same provocation throughout the entire world. And the success of that provocation the German people can trace grievously enough. What cause finally had America to enter the war against Germany? With the outbreak of the World War, which Judah had desired so passionately and so long, all the large Jewish firms of the United States began supplying ammunitions. They supplied the European war market to an extent which perhaps even they themselves had never dreamed of. A gigantic harvest, yet nothing satisfied the insatiable greed of the Jew. And so the venal press, which depended upon the stock exchange kings, began an unparalleled propaganda campaign. A gigantic organization for newspaper lying was built up. And once more, it is a Jewish concern, the Hearst Press, which set the tone of the agitation against Germany.
Hitler's account of American entry into World War I centers on the Hearst Press, William Randolph Hearst's newspaper empire, which he identifies as a Jewish operation that manipulated American public opinion against Germany. William Randolph Hearst was not Jewish. His newspapers were, in fact, notably sympathetic to Germany well into the 1930s. Hearst met Hitler personally in 1934 and came away with favorable impressions. This is the second named factual error in 3 paragraphs. Again, a straightforward falsehood, not a distortion. The broader claim that the United States entered World War I because of a Jewish press conspiracy ignores the documented historical causes entirely. Unrestricted German submarine warfare, the sinking of American ships, the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany secretly proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States, and the accumulated weight of British diplomatic pressure. These are not disputed facts. They are in every standard history of the war, but a theory that explains American intervention through Jewish conspiracy requires erasing all of them.
The hatred of these Americans was not directed solely against commercial Germany or against military Germany. It was directed specially against social Germany, because this Germany had up to that time kept itself outside of the principles which governed the world trusts. The old Reich had at least made an honorable attempt to be socially minded. We had to show for ourselves such an initiative in social institutions as no other country in the wide world could boast. This explains why, even in Germany itself, the comrades under Jewish leadership fought against their own vital interests. This explains the agitation carried on throughout the world under the same watchword. For this reason, the Jewish democratic press of America had to accomplish its masterpiece. That is to say, it had to drive into the most horrible of all wars a great peace-loving people which was as little concerned in European struggles as it was in the North Pole. America was to intervene in defense of civilization, and the Americans were persuaded so to do by an atrocity propaganda conducted in the name of civilization, which from A to Z was a scandalous invention, the like of which has never yet been seen, a farrago of lies and forgeries, because this last state in the world where social aims were being realized had to be destroyed. Therefore 26 peoples were incited one against the other by this press, which is exclusively in the possession of one and the same world people of one and the same race, and that race on principle the deadly foe of all national states.
The claim that Allied atrocity propaganda was, from A to Z, a scandalous invention requires some careful unpacking because it contains a kernel of truth wrapped around a catastrophic lie. British propaganda during World War I did exaggerate and sometimes fabricate German atrocities. The infamous stories of bayoneted babies, for instance, were largely invented. This is documented. But the framing Hitler builds on this fact is false, that all Allied accounts of German conduct were fabrications, and that real German atrocities, the documented massacre of Belgian and French civilians, the destruction of Leuven, the use of poison gas, simply did not occur. He is using a real propaganda scandal to construct a blanket denial of German war crimes. The technique is important and recognizable. Take a real instance of enemy dishonesty, generalize it into a total claim that the enemy is always lying, and use that claim to dismiss every specific accusation regardless of its evidence. It is a technique with a long afterlife.
Who could have prevented the World War? Not the Kultursolidarität, the solidarity of civilization, in whose name the Jews carried on their propaganda. Not the so-called world pacifism, again an exclusively Jewish invention. Could the so-called solidarity of the proletariat, all the wheels stand silent still, if that be your strong arm's will? The German wheel on November 9th, 1918 was indeed brought to a standstill. The Social Democratic Party and its principal organ, Vorwärts, declared in so many words that it was not in the interest of the workers that Germany should win the war. Could the Freemasons perhaps stop the war? This most noble of philanthropic institutions, who foretold the good fortune of the people louder than anyone, and who at the same time was the principal leader in promoting the war. Who, after all, are the Freemasons? You have to distinguish two grades. To the lower grade in Germany belong the ordinary citizens who, through the claptrap which is served up to them, can feel themselves to be somebodies, but the responsible authorities are those many-sided folk who can stand any climate, those 300 Rathenows who all know each other, who guide the history of the world over the heads of kings and presidents, those who will undertake any office without scruples, who know how brutally to enslave all peoples, once more the Jews.
This is the expansion of the conspiracy to its maximum scope. World pacifism, a Jewish invention. International solidarity of labor, a Jewish tool. Freemasonry, a Jewish front organization. The reference to 300 Rathenows is a specific and chilling one. Walter Rathenau was the German foreign minister, a Jewish industrialist and statesman who had been assassinated by right-wing nationalists just 9 months before this speech, in June 1922. Hitler uses his name not as a victim to be mourned, but as a symbol of Jewish world power. Those 300 who all know each other, who guide the history of the world over the heads of kings and presidents. This is the protocols of the Elders of Zion brought to life on a Munich stage, the image of a secret Jewish council steering all of human civilization from behind the scenes. The protocols were a notorious forgery, fabricated by the Russian secret police around 1903 and already exposed as such by 1921, a full 2 years before this speech, when the Times of London published a detailed investigation proving they were plagiarized from a 19th century French political satire. Hitler knew this. He didn't care.
Sir, why have the Jews been against Germany? That is made quite clear today, proved by countless facts. They use the age-old tactics of the hyena. When fighters are tired out, then go for them, then make your harvest. In war and revolutions, the Jew attained the unattainable. Hundreds of thousands of escaped Orientals become modern Europeans. Times of unrest produce miracles. Before 1914, how long would it have taken, for instance, in Bavaria before a Galician Jew became prime minister? Or in Russia before an anarchist from the New York ghetto, Bronstein, Trotsky, became dictator? Only a few wars and revolutions. That was enough to put the Jewish people into possession of the red gold and thereby to make them masters of the world. Before 1914, there were two states above all, Germany and Russia, which prevented the Jew from reaching his goal, the mastery of the world. Here, not everything which they already possessed in the Western democracies had fallen to the Jews. Here they were not the sole lords alike in the intellectual and economic life. Here, too, the parliaments were not yet exclusively instruments of Jewish capital and of the will of the Jew. The German and the genuine Russian had still preserved a certain aloofness from the Jew. In both peoples there still lived the healthy instinct of scorn for the Jew, and there was a real danger that in these monarchies there might one day arise a Frederick the Great, a William the Fair, and that democracy and a parliamentary regime might be sent to the devil. So the Jews became revolutionaries. The Republic should bring them to wealth and to power. This aim they disguised. They cried, "Down with the monarchies! Enthrone the sovereign people!" I do not know whether today one could venture to call the German or the Russian people sovereign. At least one cannot see any trace of it. What the German people can trace, however, what every day stands in the most crass form before its eyes, is debauchery, gluttony, speculation ruling unchecked, the open mockery of the Jew.
The comparison to a hyena, an animal widely associated in European culture with cowardice, filth, and scavenging, is a deliberate act of dehumanization. Once a group has been described as animal in its behavior, violence against it becomes easier to frame as pest control rather than crime. This technique has a documented relationship to genocide. The Rwandan perpetrators in 1994 called Tutsis Inyenzi, cockroaches, before and during the killing. The reference to Leon Trotsky, Bronstein, an anarchist from the New York ghetto, is triple false. Trotsky's real surname was Bronstein, But he was from Ukraine, not New York, and he was a Marxist, not an anarchist. Hitler gets all three biographical facts wrong thinking. The conclusion precedes the evidence, and the evidence is adjusted to fit.
So Russia and Germany had to be overthrown in order that the ancient prophecy might be fulfilled. So the whole world was lashed into fury. So every lie and propaganda agency was brutally set in action against the state of the last, the German idealists. And thus it was that Judah won the World War. Or would you wish to maintain that the French, the English, or the American people won the war? They, one and all, victors and vanquished, are alike defeated. One thing raises itself above them all, the world stock exchange, which has become the master of the people. What guilt had Germany herself for the outbreak of the war? Her guilt consisted in this, that at the moment when the ring closed about her existence, Germany neglected to organize her defense with such vigor that through this demonstration of her power, either the others, despite their abominable purposes, would have been robbed of their will to strike, or else the victory of the Reich would have been assured. The guilt of the German people lies in this, that when in 1912 a criminal Reichstag in its unfathomable baseness and folly had refused to allow the raising of 3 army corps, the people did not create for itself those army corps in the Reichstag's despite. With these additional 120,000 men, the Battle of the Marne would have been won and the issue of the war decided. 2 million fewer German heroes would have sunk into their graves.
Judah won the World War. The conclusion is now stated outright. Not France, not Britain, not America, Judah. The victorious nations are dismissed as equally defeated dupes. Only the World Stock Exchange, code for Jewish finance, truly won. This is the conspiracy theory at its most totalizing. An entire world war involving 30 nations and killing 20 million people is reframed as a Jewish operation from beginning to end. The historical responsibility for World War I is among the most studied questions in modern historiography. It involves the interlocking alliance systems, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the mobilization plans of multiple powers, and the cascading failures of European diplomacy. No serious historian, then or now, attributes it to a Jewish conspiracy. Hitler's explanation for Germany's guilt is also revealing. Not that the war was launched recklessly or that German diplomacy failed, but that Germany was insufficiently armed and failed to override its own parliament by force. Germany's error, in his account, was too much democracy and too little military power, the same conclusion he reaches from every starting point.
Who was it who in 1912, as in 1918, struck its weapons from the hands of the German people? Who was it that in 1912, as in the last year of the war, infatuated the German people with his theory that if Germany throws down her arms, the whole world will follow her example? Who? The democratic Marxist Jew, who at the same hour incited and still today incites the others to arm and to subjugate barbarous Germany. But someone may perhaps yet raise the question whether it is expedient today to talk about the guilt for the war. Most assuredly, we have the duty to talk about it. For the murderers of our fatherland, who all the years through have betrayed and sold Germany, they are the same men who, as the November criminals, have plunged us into the depths of misfortune. We have the duty to speak, since in the near future, when we have gained power, we shall have the further duty of taking these creators of ruin, these clouts, these traitors to their state, and of hanging them on the gallows to which they belong. Only let no one think that in them there has come a change of heart. On the contrary, these November scoundrels, who still are free to go as they will in our midst, they are, even today, going against us.
Two things in this passage demand close attention. The first is the phrase, "in the near future, when we have gained power." Hitler is stating explicitly in a public speech that once his movement takes power, it will execute its political opponents, not prosecute them, not imprison them, hang them. This is not a threat made in anger or in passing. It is a policy announcement delivered calmly to a crowd. The second is the rhetorical question structure that opens the passage. Who was it who struck weapons from Germany's hands? The democratic Marxist Jew. The question and answer format, with Hitler providing both the question and the answer, creates the illusion of logical deduction while preventing any actual examination of evidence. The audience experiences the sensation of arriving at a conclusion through reasoning, while in fact being told what to conclude. It is one of the most effective techniques in the demagogue's repertoire, and Hitler uses it. Throughout this speech with practiced ease,
from the recognition of the facts comes the will to rise again. 2 millions have remained on the field of battle. They too have their rights, and not we, the survivors, alone. There are millions of orphans, of cripples, of widows in our midst. They too have rights. For the Germany of today, not one of them died, not one of them became a cripple, an orphan, or a widow. We owe it to these millions that we build a new Germany.
the speech ends not with hatred, but with grief, and this tonal shift is deliberate and significant. After an hour of conspiracy theory, accusations, and calls for executions, Hitler closes with the dead, the crippled, the orphaned, and the widowed. This is emotionally precise. The audience has been wound tight with anger and ideology, and now they are offered something to weep for. The 2 million German dead of World War I were real. The orphans and widows were real. The suffering was real. And Hitler's final move is to claim that suffering as the property of his movement, that the new Germany he is building is the monument those dead deserve. This is one of the most powerful and most cynical techniques in the speech, the appropriation of genuine grief to legitimize a political program that has nothing to do with honoring the dead and everything to do with using them as fuel. An audience that has been made to feel it is acting on behalf of its fallen soldiers is an audience that has been made very difficult to reason with. Adolf Hitler delivered this speech on April 13, 1923. By the time he finished, he had explained the origins of World War I, the Russian Revolution, American intervention, British imperialism, the failure of international law, and the current collapse of Germany, all through a single causal mechanism, Jewish conspiracy. Every named piece of evidence he offered was either distorted or outright false. Northcliffe was not Jewish. Hearst was not Jewish. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which underpins the entire framework, had been exposed as a forgery 2 years earlier. Trotsky was from Ukraine, not New York. None of this was hidden information. All of it was verifiable. What this speech shows us is not the power of lies alone. It is the power of a total explanatory system delivered to people in genuine pain. When the world is collapsing around you and someone offers you a framework that explains everything, that converts every humiliation, every loss, every confusion, into a single legible enemy, the emotional appeal is enormous. The antidote is not outrage. It is exactly what this series attempts: the patient, factual, unglamorous work of showing how each piece of the machinery operates, one gear at a time.